So I was born in New Jersey and did my first 2 years of college there, and then realized that I didn't want to be on the East Coast and moved to California and never looked back. So I lived in California for 16 years, now BC, British Columbia for another 16 at the same amount of time. And so I moved to the West Coast and never went back.
Yeah.
I like it out here.
So what was it about the West Coast that drew you?
The landscape primarily. I
Yeah.
just like the big nature, ocean, big mountains. The weather in California, at least, not so much in BC.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Mediterranean climate, it's what Northern California is kind of my ideal part of the world.
Yeah. You didn't want super cold winters and snow and things like that.
Yeah, no. And the landscape just it's just really speaks to me in some weird way. The colors, shape of the mountains, I really like it there.
And were you a physical kind of person? You like to be outdoors?
Yeah. So I kayak, I hike, I mushroom forage. I like to get out and get out in nature. So yeah.
Very nice. How long have you been mushroom foraging?
I mean, I did it back in college. I'd go for
Okay.
chanterelles in the Bay Area. And then I stopped for a while when I moved to BC. And now I'm learning BC mushrooms and kind of when they come out here, which is really different from California.
Yeah.
But yeah, big chanterelle season right now here. So I'm
Very cool.
watching people gathering baskets full up in the North Shore. I have a Facebook group where people post photos. So I'm trying to get up hopefully this week, do a little chanterelling.
That's very cool. Now, do you do that on your own or with your family?
My own. I've been trying to get my daughter to go with me, but she's a reluctant mushroomer. She's 14 now. Back when she was little, she loved doing that kind of stuff. But now she's a 14-year-old, so
It's not as cool as it
a little
used
bit
to be,
different.
huh?
Not as cool. Yeah.
I got you. Now, I was fascinated with your book, so I wanted to get into Drunk, but I noticed that you had a lot of Chinese philosophy, history, and whatnot in it. So when did that interest in China start?
In high school, I got interested in Chinese philosophy. I read some early Taoist texts in translation. But I was a science major for my first 2 years. So it was really when I moved to California that I made the switch and switched to Chinese studies.
So
And my BA and my MA are in Chinese, and then my PhD is in religious studies with a focus on Chinese philosophy and religion.
and was it Taoism that drew you into it? Was that what you found the most interesting?
Yeah, I think so. Taoism and Zen, which Taoism kind of gave rise to.
That's fascinating. So do you speak, read, and write?
I used to speak Mandarin back in the 1980s. I lived in Taiwan. I spoke it fairly well, but it's not, my specialty is classical Chinese. So it's kind of like Latin. Like if you study Latin, it's easier to learn Italian, but they're not the same language. So my specialty is classical Chinese. So that's what I teach, and that's what I'm a specialist in.
Which school were you at on the West Coast? Was that at Berkeley or at Stanford?
Both. I finished my BA at Stanford, went to Berkeley, got an MA, and then went back to Stanford for my PhD.
Yeah. So what are you currently doing now? You're at the University of British Columbia.
Yeah, I'm in the Department of Philosophy, and I teach early Chinese thought. Just finished this book on the history of intoxication, which is a bit of a departure from my previous work, and thinking about the next book project, which will probably be an academic book.
And you did write a book before Drunk. You wrote one about Taoism, correct?
Yeah, I have one other trade or popular book called Try Not to Try. And they're actually, Try Not to Try and Drunk are connected. So Try Not to Try is about this early Chinese idea of wu wei, or effortless action. So it's the state kind of like being in the zone in sports where you're relaxed, you lose a sense of yourself as an agent, everything kind of works out, you're charismatic, people like you. And so the early Chinese thinkers all want you to get into this state, but they, at some level, they mostly don't consciously recognize this, but some of them do. there's a paradox involved in trying not to try, right? If you tell someone relax, they don't
Yeah.
relax. And so I call this the paradox of Wu Wei, or the paradox of trying not to try. And it's a genuine paradox. So I talk about the cognitive science of this in my last book. When you're trying not to try, the part of your brain you're activating is actually the part you're trying to shut down. So it's just actively, directly paradoxical to try not to try. And so the Chinese developed various strategies for kind of tricking yourself into not trying. So, do this with your body, meditate, do these rituals. But it occurred to me another way to get around this paradox is alcohol. So, one way to get around the problem of consciously trying to be spontaneous is, instead of trying yourself to shut part of your brain down, to take a chemical that will actually shut it down. So it's a kind of alcohol is a way to directly reach in and kind of down regulate that part of your brain that's in charge of trying, essentially. So it could help. It's a chemical shortcut to spontaneity, if you want to think of it that way.
Now, was that what inspired you to write this book, or how did this idea come about for Drunk?
That was one inspiration. So realizing that cultures seem to have figured out that you can have these religious practices, meditation practices, rituals, and things that can help people get around the paradox of spontaneity, but you also can use chemical substances, and sometimes you can use them in combination. So that was part of it. The other part is that my last big research project that I ran was on the evolution of religion. So on this puzzle of kind of why religious beliefs and behaviors are sometimes really costly. You taboo certain foodstuffs that are delicious. You scarify yourself or cut off the foreskin of your penis, or spend your day off sitting on a hard bench listening to a boring sermon when you could be out farming. It's puzzling why people do this from a naturalistic perspective, right? They're doing it because God wants them to. But if you're from a scientific perspective, if you are assuming that there's no God that's going to be rewarding them, why does this behavior survive? Why do cultures that spend huge proportion of their gross national product on useless religious monuments do better than societies that take that same money and build irrigation canals or fortifications or do something useful with it? In ancient China, the biggest archaeological sites, are these huge tombs where massive amounts of wealth and sophisticated tools, and like the terracotta army of the first emperor of Qin is this massive army made out of anatomically correct, individually made soldiers. So they built this huge thing, and then they just buried it in the ground. It's like, yeah. It was really weird, right? So our grant project was trying to explain this puzzle. And so the argument is that, well, it's really costly, but it has certain social benefits. And so certain individual and social benefits. And so the benefits pay for the costs. And I started to think of intoxication, the use of chemical intoxicants, as very similar to religion, in the sense that it's universal. Humans have been doing it for as long as we've been doing anything. We assume when we go to a new culture, we're not surprised to see people worshiping gods and having religious practices and making monuments. We also are not surprised when they're consuming chemical intoxicants and when they welcome us with chemical intoxicants. But it should be surprising, because like religion, chemical intoxicants are really costly, both at the individual and social level. And so my argument in Drunk is that for the taste for intoxication to survive in us as a species genetically, and also to survive in cultures as a cultural option, it must be paying for itself somehow. It must be offering some kind of adaptive benefit to pay for the obvious costs. So I came to see, in a way, the study of the history of intoxicant use isn't that different from the way I approach the study of religion.
Now, how did you go about researching? Obviously, you have this project, but then you decide to focus on intoxication itself. How
Yeah,
did that process go?
you just the way you do anything new. I have friends in the field, so I have friends who know people or work themselves on psychology of intoxication. So I have them hook me up with their friends, and they recommend, a list of 30 articles I should read. They recommend books. The books have bibliographies, so then I go and read everything in the bibliography. I spent about a year and a half doing the research for the book, and relying on colleagues who had relevant expertise, and then just kind of digging around myself.
Now, I noticed in the book that you mentioned that sort of academic reluctance to talk about intoxication or to talk about it in a way that's even neutral, if not positive. How was it
Yeah.
going to your colleagues and asking them about this project you're doing on intoxication?
Well, they're a self-selecting group, right? So there are people who actually study intoxication, so they're more prone to think that it's an interesting topic. I mean, I will say it's interesting that one colleague who was really helpful for me said that he really had a tension when he was writing about alcohol, and even a tension in terms of the studies he was designing, because he gets government funding, and the government funding tends to be, we want to fund stuff that's going to mitigate alcoholism. We're going to fund stuff that's going to blunt the, dangers of alcohol. It's the alcohol is treated purely as a vice and purely from a medical perspective. And he was actually interested in some of the positive social effects of alcohol. But he said he was really kind of he was worried about upplaying that too much. He was worried that he might not get funded if he upplayed that too much. So it's a tricky thing to research. It's hard to get human subject approval to do studies with alcohol. So it's a neglected topic. And if you look at the field, one of the fields I'm involved in is evolution, cognitive science of religion. And that field is very interested in human religiosity, human ritual practice. So we study how people dance and how they sing and scarify themselves and do painful rituals, stay up all night. But we almost universally ignore the fact that at the same time, they're drinking or doing mushrooms and so it's weird. The chemical intoxicants are talked about. So I do think one of the goals of the book was to get my colleagues in academia who work on these aspects of human experience to start taking intoxication use more seriously, both as a puzzle and as a fundamental feature of how humans are in the world.
Yeah, that's what drew me most into the book, was a serious academic look at intoxication, because people either treat it, in popular culture, they treat it sort of as a joke or the dark side of it, how it's so terrible for everything, but nobody looks at it seriously in a, as you call it, a trade publication. It was great to see something in popular culture that's looking at it. Now, you mentioned two mainstream theories on why humans get drunk. There was a hangover and a hijack theory, but you have a different view. Could you share your view on it?
Yeah, so all of the dominant scientific theories of intoxicant use, which, once I started digging into the literature, these are pretty much the only options. One is they're both mistake theories. So they both think that it's an evolutionary mistake that we like to drink. The first is the hijack theory. So, and this is probably the most dominant one, is that alcohol just happens to hijack reward circuits in our brain that evolve for other reasons. So there's nothing adaptive about alcohol. It's like a key that turned by accident. It happens to turn this lock in our brains that makes us feel good. So that's the standard theory. And that's a hijack theory because it's basically hijacking reward networks that evolve for other reasons. So in that respect, our taste for intoxication would be kind of like our taste for masturbation, right? We get orgasms that their adaptive rationale is to reward us for reproductive sex, right? Evolution gives us this big reward for doing the thing that it most wants us to do, which is pass on our genes. But then clever humans and other animals figure out that they can get that reward other ways, and they do, right? We've invented all sorts of ways to do it. So that's a classic hijack. The problem is that in the masturbation, contrary to what kids are sometimes taught, doesn't make you go blind. It's not physiologically costly.
I can still see.
You can still see, right? Alcohol can make you go blind. So masturbation is costless. Its evolution can afford to ignore it because it doesn't really cost very much. It's not harmful. Alcohol use is a whole nother story. It's very harmful potentially, and it's very costly. So that's why it doesn't make the hijack hypothesis doesn't make sense. Hangover theories are a different type of mistake theory. So in hangover theories, our taste for alcohol had an adaptive value at one point, but doesn't anymore. And there's a few of these hangover theories. One is that water supplies for early humans were often contaminated. And if you ferment water into beer, for instance, it often purifies it. It's safer to drink. And so one theory is, well, people who had a taste for alcohol did better because they had a lower pathogen load because they weren't drinking dirty water. This guy, Robert Dudley at Berkeley, had what he called the drunken monkey hypothesis, that our primate ancestors essentially in the jungles learned to associate the smell of ethanol, the alcohol molecule, with food sources because it's very volatile. It travels a long distance and it's associated with ripe or overripe fruit. So it was a way for us to find these very valuable packages of calories in the jungle. So it was adaptive. The taste for alcohol led us to fruit and overripe fruit. But now it's not adaptive because we have supermarket aisles full of wine, and that's not what we really evolved to deal with. So in that sense, our taste for alcohol is like our taste for Twinkies or junk food, right? Desire for sugar and fat was adaptive in our evolutionary environment, but then once we live in industrialized societies and we have 7-Elevens on every corner, it becomes maladaptive. So those are the hangover theories. And I walk through the various hangover theories and dismiss them one by one in the book. I don't think any of them are really satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ones you see on TV.
Yeah. And, there may be something to some of the hangover theories. So it's not impossible that there's multiple things going on, that maybe there is something helpful about, having a taste for beer over water. Maybe like fruit flies, our lineage does have a kind of taste for alcohol because it leads to calories, but there's got to be something else going on because typical hangovers, like the junk food one, the reason we have the junk food hangover is because this is a very recent problem and a very geographically constrained problem. There's still lots of places in the world where getting enough fat and sugar is a serious problem for people. So that's why evolution hasn't dealt with it yet, because it's a local and recent problem. Alcohol, or taste for alcohol and the quantities where it becomes dangerous is something that we've been having to deal with for at least probably 20,000 years, but certainly at least 13,000 years. So that's where the hangover theories don't make sense. So my theory is that alcohol's got to have adaptive value at both the individual and the group level. And so the bulk of the book is kind of walking through what some of these adaptive advantages are. So enhanced creativity. Human beings are very dependent on creativity and innovation, and alcohol helps us to essentially think outside the box. It enhances our ability to think in a lateral way or in a creative way. It reduces inhibitions, which allows us to share new ideas with other people more readily. It boosts kind of feel-good hormones. So it boosts endorphins, serotonin. And so it makes us like other people more and feel better about ourselves. So it has a really important role to play in social bonding. And there's a really good reason why it's always been used as a tool in diplomacy and business settings because it's a way for you to suss out. I'm arguing it's a really important tool that humans have used to get past cooperation dilemmas where we have to, the best payoff is going to come if we all can trust each other, but it's a situation where we're vulnerable to being taken advantage of. So economists call these free rider problems or prisoner's dilemma problems, tragedy of the commons. Alcohol helps us trust people, and they walk through a series of reasons why that would be. It helps. It reduces stress, so it makes us feel better. So it actually has an individual level function where, you know, there's a good reason people use it as a kind of transition device between work and relaxation. You come home at the end of the day, you have a glass of wine. It's not just, there's something ritually important about it. So there's something ritually kind of, it's a signal both to other people and to yourself that the workday is over and some other part of the day has started. But it's also chemically doing things to you. It's boosting serotonins. It is relaxing you. It helps people deal with intimacy challenges. So again, good reason people on a first date often, you know, go out to dinner and have wine because you're nervous, you don't know the other person very well, you need to relax. It's a glass or two of wine down regulates your prefrontal cortex enough that you relax. You're more disinhibited. You're more honest. You're more relaxed. So it's doing a lot of different things for people that must have historically been very useful for us, because otherwise the taste for it would have been eliminated by either genetic or cultural evolution.
And you highlighted the fact that now there's this idea that we started making alcohol before we started doing agriculture, which I thought was fascinating.
That was something I didn't know going into the research. That was something I discovered when I started digging into the literature on this. So I assumed, and I'd always been taught, that in a similar way where the standard scientific story is our taste for alcohol is an evolutionary mistake, the standard historical story is that the discovery of alcohol was a mistake. So we got agriculture, we learned how to grow grains, we started making bread and things like that. And then somebody left their sourdough starter out too long and it started to ferment. And we were like, oh, that smells interesting. And we tried it and it was good. And we discovered beer. Right. So the standard story is that's, you know, beer and wine, stuff like that is a side effect of agriculture. But when you look at the archaeological literature, it looks like people were gathering, hunter-gatherers, so people who did not have agriculture yet, were gathering and creating these really impressive ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe in present-day Turkey. It's a 10, 12,000-year-old site. They're erecting these enormous stone stelae with animal carvings on them. They're really impressive sites, especially when you realize they were built by hunter-gatherers. Right. They're doing some kind of, they didn't live there. They were coming together to do this from this region, from all over this region, and then feasting. So there's remains of feasting, animal bones, and then there are large vats that held some kind of liquid. And we don't have direct chemical residue evidence from this particular site, but my money is it was beer in those big vessels, right? We know they were making beer in this region before, about 1,000 years before this time. So they were almost certainly making beer, and possibly even beer laced with hallucinogens. So you know, this sort of evidence is what gave rise to the so-called beer before bread hypothesis, which is that it was the desire to get intoxicated that caused people to start domesticating crops, not the desire to make bread. And this is bolstered in the Fertile Crescent. There's a debate about this in the Fertile Crescent. Some people have argued bread was first, you know, some people have argued both were going on at the same time. If you look at other parts of the world, though, you see that the first domesticated species seem to have been chosen for their psychoactive properties. So in South America, the ancestor to maize or corn the wild ancestor, is this plant called Teosinte.
Hmm.
And Teosinte makes terrible grain. Like if your goal was to make tortillas or bread, you would ignore this plant because it's got very small seeds. It doesn't have very good seeds, but the stalk actually has a lot of sugar in it, and it makes great beer. And it's almost clear. It's almost definitely the case that people started paying attention to this plant, cultivating it, domesticating it, because they were making chicha, the ancestor to chicha, which is this beer that's still made out of maize to this day in South America. So people wouldn't have paid attention to this plant if their goal was to get a foodstuff. If their goal was to ferment it, that makes more sense. See a similar thing with tobacco in North America, and really powerful tobacco that was mixed with hallucinogens typically. And in Australia, there's herbs that are involved in this substance called pituri, which is intoxicating, usually chewed as a kind of a chewing tobacco. Again, seems to have been a focus of human cultivation for its psychoactive properties. So in this sense, it's the desire to get drunk or high or stoned seems to have driven people to settle down and start agriculture.
So that they could make more of it and have it readily available.
Yeah, yeah. So in this sense, the desire to get drunk directly created civilization. It's the reason we started settling down. And then once we did, it kind of helped us deal with the transition, because the transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyle to early urban or even large village societies was probably pretty harsh for most people. You're now suddenly hunter-gatherers, especially Fertile Crescent, have a pretty diverse lifestyle. They're hunting and gathering. They have a diverse diet. They're relatively egalitarian, so everyone's involved in decision making and has some kind of power. Once you get these beginning early agricultural villages, you start to get social stratification. You start to get people who are in charge and people who are obeying. You get really intense density, so you're kind of living on top of other people, crowded along with strangers, and your diet starts to suck. You're starting to eat a lot of just bread. You don't have much in the way of fresh vegetables or meat the way that hunter-gatherers have. And so probably alcohol did something to both diversify their diets. So this is one of the hangover theories that I think probably is a factor, is that when you ferment grain into beer, you enrich it biologically. You create micronutrients that aren't present in bread, for instance. So it's possible that beer combined with bread made the starch-based diet more healthy. But the other thing it's doing is relaxing you. So you had a crappy day working on the pyramids all day. You come home at the end of the day, you have some beer. It helps you cope with the stress of your day. And there's good, I mean, we understand why alcohol reduces stress. And we see that, you take rats and you crowd them in a cage and they start drinking. They start hitting the alcohol feeder a lot more than if they're not crowded. And so probably something similar was going on with humans.
I'm glad you brought up Egypt, because I remember learning about how you don't think about it. You just see the giant pyramid, but of course there was a giant work site next to it where all of the workers lived, and they found these giant, basically beer vats.
Yeah.
And that was part of their payment, and their diet was beer and bread and maybe a little bit of protein. And that's all you were getting by on. Yeah.
And so the beer was actually part of the food. I mean, beer's a food, right? It's got micronutrients, it's got a lot of calories. The Guinness, there's a meal in every glass. It's true, right? There's a lot of calories, and there are a lot of vitamins as well. So this is another thing you see, probably, as far back as Göbekli Tepe, is alcohol being used to mobilize workforces, to get people to come together and work together, right? So how are you going to convince hunter-gatherers to come and work on, quarry these enormous stones and drag them, 500 meters, and raise them and carve them? You pay them in beer. That's what the pyramid builders were paid in. To this day, in parts of the world where there's not a really strong market economy, you want to do anything big, like an irrigation system or build a big public building, you pay people in alcohol. You feast them, you give them food as well, but a big part of the draw is intoxicating beverages. So they become also tools of, I want to look at it, tools of power. So the people who control the alcohol can command workforces. And certainly, if you look at the Incan Empire, it was very much based on chicha, the production. They controlled, the Incan rulers controlled the production of chicha. They used it as a trade item and a way to pay people. And it was, in a very significant sense, their power was based on the production and control of this alcohol.
That's fascinating because even now in many countries, there are a lot of very specific tax laws on alcohol and different types of alcohol and what qualifies as a certain alcohol. And that's fascinating that it goes back thousands of years, but it's still going on to this day.
Yeah. Governments are still relying on alcohol in a sense to support public good. It's just a couple steps removed, right?
Yeah.
They're collecting tax money and then paying people wages to build a bridge. Whereas it used to be they just pay them directly in beer, but it's not that far removed.
Yeah. Another thing that I found fascinating is you talked about societies that have openly banned intoxicants, and yet they're still really important in them.
Yeah, well, I mean, people, because alcohol is a two-sided thing. It does have these benefits, I'm arguing for these benefits that it has, but I also recognize all the dangers that alcohol presents. And that's why cultures have always used it, but they've always been a little leery of it. So Dionysus, the god of wine for the ancient Greeks, was worshipped, but he was also feared. You had to be a little careful around Dionysus. He could give you gifts like he's the one who gave the golden touch to Midas, which seems like a really good idea, but then turned out to not work very well.
Right.
So Dionysus is a kind of two-faced god. He can give benefits, but he can also exact payment in the form of these costs. And so cultures have always been worried about alcohol. They've always surrounded its use with different types of restrictions and ritual regulations. And prohibition's been a constantly tempting strategy. So people have been trying to prohibit alcohol consumption since they've been making alcohol. In ancient China, there's like 10 different times I could think of when the central government tried to ban alcohol, and it never worked, but they tried. American prohibition didn't work out so well. Islam, pretty early on decided that they were going to ban alcohol, but the degree to which that's actually enforced really varies wildly, place to place and different historical periods. And also depending on your social class, often the elites got around these prohibitions in various ways. So it's a funny thing, and especially because prohibition is such a great idea. If alcohol only had costs and it didn't have any benefits, the first cultural group to successfully impose it should have done really, really well and should have succeeded at the expense of other cultural groups. And by now, because cultural tricks that are good spread really fast, by now prohibition should be everywhere if alcohol didn't have any benefits. And yet, if you look at a map of the world and see where prohibition is actually enforced in the contemporary world, it's not very many places.
Yeah.
So clearly, there are countervailing benefits that are causing people are resisting prohibition, not just because they like to drink and they're like rats pressing levers to get cocaine or get more alcohol. Prohibition has failed to take off because it imposes its own kind of costs by depriving people of the benefits of alcohol.
Now, it seems the biggest challenge then is how you balance those two things, because there are going to be people that just no matter what won't drink or can't drink. And then there's going to be plenty of people that like to enjoy it or use it as a tool or whatever they're going to do with it. So how do you balance those two things?
Well, also as an individual, you need to know what your risk factors are. So it's estimated that as much as 15% of the population is genetically disposed toward alcoholism. So a pretty big percentage of the population has trouble using alcohol in a responsible way. So if you have a history of alcoholism in your family, or you know that you have alcoholic tendencies yourself, you got to obviously be super careful in your use of it. I think that cultures have better and worse strategies for using alcohol. So I talk in the book a bit about the difference between Northern and Southern drinking cultures. So this is referring to Europe. So Southern European countries like Spain and Portugal, Greece, Italy, alcohol is part of everyday life. They're drinking primarily wine and beers, not so much distilled liquors. They have some distilled liquors, but they don't drink them in large quantities. Alcohol is always consumed socially at the dinner table in a family environment. You know, the whole family is there. Kids are there. Kids are introduced to alcohol quite early. You know, kids get a glass of watered down wine at an early age at the dinner table, and regular wine at an age that would shock Americans. You know, it's pretty early. And drunkenness is not encouraged. So people drink, public drunkenness is frowned upon. If you drink enough that you're visibly drunk, people kind of look at you sideways. All of these tendencies seem to suppress alcoholism, seem to guard against alcoholism. So it's probably the case that humans have an identical kind of 15%-ish tendency toward alcoholism, but actual rates of alcoholism vary a lot culture to culture. And in Italy, for instance, the alcoholism rates are quite low, even though they actually drink a lot of alcohol. So per capita, they drink a large quantity of alcohol, but they don't seem to have drinking problems in the same way that the US or Germany or Russia have. So those other cultures, the US inherited this from the immigrants who came here. The Northern cultures drink to get drunk. You know, they often will just drink, they'll just go out drinking. They'll drink distilled liquors. They drink a lot of vodka and other types of distilled liquors. Getting drunk is not only not frowned upon, but it's kind of celebrated, like it's a manly thing to do. Alcohol's taboo, so kids aren't allowed to drink, and it's kind of a grown-up thing that only grown-ups get to do. And all those features tend to make alcohol use unhealthy. When kids finally do start drinking, get access to alcohol, they binge drink, they don't know how to use it responsibly. So one of my arguments in the book is that we should be more like the Southern European cultures to get it better. And, you know, we should integrate alcohol into our daily lives. We should introduce our children to it relatively early, you know, just that it's part of a meal and it enhances the taste of food. So it won't be this kind of taboo thing that they're going to, you know, go out in the woods and get drunk on alcohol they stole out of their parents' liquor cabinet. Right. And beware of distilled liquors. So this also surprised me in the research. I always thought of distilled liquors as just something that's always been around, but that's not true. We've understood the principles of distillation forever. Like Aristotle wrote about it, but distillation is an easy concept. So you take a mixture of beer or wine. So beer or wines have a natural limit on alcohol content. So the yeast are turning the sugars into alcohol, and they're relatively resistant to alcohol, but at a certain point, they essentially poison themselves and they stop producing alcohol. So there's a limit to how strong you can get through natural fermentation.
Yeah, I think you mentioned New Zealand was like the strongest, and that was what, 16 or?
That's like 16% ABV. You can maybe hit 17, but that's also with modern yeast. So that's with these weird yeasts that we've developed to do that. I mean, naturally occurring yeast, you can't get that high. So, you know, historically, most cultures drink what we would call beers. So something made out of grains, and those typically have come in at about 2-3% ABV. So that's what we've mostly been drinking. Fruit wines will be a little bit stronger naturally, but not much more. But once we learned how to distill reliably, and we could do it on a large scale, so you're heating up a beer or a wine essentially. The ethanol is more volatile, so it boils off first, and then you capture it and turn it back into liquid, and you do it again. You can get like something that's in the 90s% alcohol. That's what vodka is. And that's dangerous stuff. It's like so incredibly stronger than anything we've ever had access to, that even though it's technically the same drug, it's just ethanol. I think distilled liquors should be viewed as a different drug. They're just a complete sea change in terms of danger and strength. And they're relatively recent. So it's really, in Europe, it's only been 1600, 1700s that we've had access to distilled liquors. So I think cultural evolution and certainly genetic evolution haven't had a chance to catch up with the danger of distilled liquor yet.
It's funny because I think I stumbled into the Southern style of drinking because the Northern style made me sick. Like I couldn't handle distilled liquor on an empty stomach. I always wanted to eat something with it. And also my father was probably unusual for someone from our background, but he would like give me a spoonful of wine on my birthday since I was little. And so I wasn't curious about it. I wasn't like, oh, I wonder what it's like. I thought it tasted terrible. And so I never wanted to really
do.
So I didn't want to drink it. So that's fascinating.
But it removed the mystery of it, right? And so it wasn't this taboo thing. I mean, same. So my ex-wife's half Italian. We spent a lot of time in Italy, a lot of relatives there. So my daughter grew up in this more Southern style culture. And we introduced her to wine pretty early on, the way Italians do. So you get, a kid has a water glass and you put, a few drops of wine in it when they're really little, and then you add a little bit more. And she just, wine's not a big deal. It's not this kind of mysterious substance that only adults get access to. And I think that helps. It really changes people's propensity. It makes it less likely that you're going to binge drink or drink in a dangerous way.
There was a part of the book that I thought was really interesting. You're talking about social regulation. So all these different groups of people when they're together versus like in America where you have this weird drinking culture where it's very okay to be home alone drinking. And especially in the pandemic, it was so easy to do that. Whereas like you talk about the Chinese banquets where there was a person that's sort of, I don't know what you would call that role, but they basically, unless they were toasting, you weren't throwing back any more alcohol.
So, so the twin dangers of modernity are distillation, so the access to these really dangerous distilled liquors, and then isolation. So for most of our history, we were drinking relatively low alcohol beers and wines, and we were always drinking them in a social environment. It's in a historical context, it's very rare to have private access to alcohol. To have alcohol in your private home is weird. Even cultures that where alcohol production is done in private homes, there's often taboos against drinking your own alcohol. So you produce it at home, but you're not allowed to drink the stuff you produce. You have to go to your neighbor's house to drink. It's interesting. So, cultures recognize that there's something dangerous about letting people drink at home. And so it's always done in public. It's always done in a communal environment, and always surrounded with various rituals that control people's consumption. So Chinese banquets, they often drink distilled liquor, this baijiu, this very strong sorghum liquor, but you don't drink at will. You have the cup of baijiu at your place, and then when someone makes a toast, everyone says ganbei, make your cup empty, dry, literally, and you shoot it, and then you put it back down, and then someone comes and fills it back up again. But then it sits there. It's not like you just keep sipping at will. You leave it there until another toast is made. And who is allowed to make toasts is ritually controlled. The host is usually in charge of that, and then maybe some of the senior people can propose toasts. There's kind of unspoken rules about, at what point in the evening other people can make toasts. But the point is the pace of drinking is being controlled. And the host can kind of ramp things up if things are getting a little boring, or if people are starting to get out of control, slow things down. You see this in ancient Greece, the symposium, or these wine parties that they would have. Essentially, the host was called the symposiarch, the ruler of the symposium, and no one drank until the symposiarch passed the wine around, and then everyone would take a sip. And the symposiarch was in charge of deciding when to send that alcohol around the group. They were in charge of deciding how strong to make the wine, because the Greeks would water it down. So they would add more or less water. And so they were able to control the consumption of the people around them. And we don't realize this even in very informal social situations. Like if you're at the pub with some friends, you wouldn't think of that as a ritually controlled environment, but it is, right? There's certain rituals, like you drink in rounds. You don't just sit there drinking as much as you want, and every time the wait person comes by, you grab another drink if you want to. You match your drinking to the people you're with. If you're drinking faster than me, typically you have to wait until I'm done and it's time to order another round, right? That moderates your drinking. The fact that you have to order it from someone and they have to go get it for you moderates your drinking. That all that goes out the door if you're home, especially if you're home alone, and you've got access to a liquor cabinet and a wine rack, and you can just drink as much as you want. It's really we're not adapted to control our drinking by ourselves, I think. And so drinking alone is really dangerous. And I think we've seen this during the pandemic where, a lot of social drinking got shut down, right? You weren't able to go out and drink at restaurants. So instead of going out after work and having a beer with your colleagues where it's social, it's controlled, you've been doing Zoom meetings all day, and then you just start drinking at home as much as you want. People started drinking a lot more. So quantity of drinking went up, problem drinking increased. And I think it just shows how difficult it is to drink safely outside of a social context.
Yeah, and you also mentioned something that I hadn't thought of, where in these social contexts, there's a lot of innovation going on. People are exchanging ideas, and also because they've downregulated themselves, they can say things that maybe in a formal situation they'd feel embarrassed about, or they would think was stupid. And so you had this concern that while people were on a Zoom call, they couldn't get that same interaction, and that we would see innovation in places like Silicon Valley go down.
Yeah. So alcohol is an engine for innovation, both by ramping up individual creativity. So it's by turning down your prefrontal cortex a little bit, it's allowing you to think in a lateral way more easily. So you're coming up with more interesting divergent ideas than you would if you hadn't done that. But it's also, as you said, decreasing your inhibitions. And so you have a creative idea, and then you're more likely to share it because you're not filtering yourself. You're more likely to just blurt out stuff that comes into your head when you've had a drink or two, right? You're feeling better about other people. You tend to be feeling better about hearing new ideas. And so, alcohol-based sociality is an important engine for innovation. You see this in, I talk about Google, how Google uses whiskey rooms to kind of help coders get past problems when they run into a wall. I talked a bit about how this big grant we got at UBC arguably arose because a pub was built on campus, and we finally had a place to drink socially after work, and we started meeting and talking about stuff. And next thing you know, we had a $3 million grant and produced all these amazing outcomes that wouldn't have happened without a pub. So it's that combination of in-person socializing. You downregulate your prefrontal cortex, so you're thinking more creatively, you're feeling better, your like mood is elevated, your serotonins are up, endorphins are up. That's a great way to produce new ideas. You take the same people and you stick them all by themselves in their homes and you put them on Zoom. So they're not getting the normal social signals you're getting in person. Even the best internet connection is shitty compared to real conversation. And my partner is a psychologist. So actually, one of the things she studies is conversation, and timing is crucial. And timing down to milliseconds, like really small gaps of time, is crucial in conversation. And that all gets screwed up when we're online. There's even slight delays mess that up. People don't know when it's okay to interrupt. They miss time interventions. And then on top of all that, we're not doing the thing we normally did, which was having a beer. Right. So, we're not getting the benefits of that. And so, yeah, I predict that, the canceling, for instance, of annual conferences where people would go to listen to talks and to give talks, but, primarily they go to socialize outside of the talks with their colleagues and friends from grad school typically over alcohol. The replacement of that with these online conferences or Zoom calls has got to be resulting in reduced innovation. And I do look at one study that looks at correlation evidence that the imposition of American prohibition resulted in a decrease in innovation measured by patent applications. So there's some correlational evidence for this, but it falls out of what we know about creativity and bonding and just how humans interact, that once we lose the ability to socialize over alcohol, we lose a lot. It's not just pleasure that we're losing. We're losing a driver of innovation.
Now, I had a couple of questions left for you. First one, Edward, what do you like to drink?
I'm more of a wine. I'm not a big beer person. I don't mind. I like the taste of beer, but I just don't, for whatever reason, don't like to drink beer. So mainly wine. I'm into wine.
Red wine, white wine, all wine?
All wine. It depends on, I've always been baffled by that. Do you like red wine or white wine?
It's all good.
I don't know. It's all good. It all depends on the content. Like, what
Sure.
are you eating? Like, it depends on what the weather's like.
Yes.
But yeah, so it's been hard. It's hard being a wine lover in Canada because it's hard to get good wine, especially coming from California. It was a bit of a shock.
Yeah. You were right in the heart of it, especially up there in Northern California.
I was right in the heart of it. So I do miss California wine. So I have a place in Northern California now that I'll eventually retire to. So I've got a wine cellar down there. So when I'm down in California, I have access to good stuff again.
There you go.
And then when I'm in Canada, I try to just limp along on whatever I can afford here.
Yeah, because I think that the taxes are much higher, aren't they?
Yeah, the taxes are like almost 200%. So, and just the availability, and like in BC, everything has to be imported through the liquor board. So there's just not a lot of choice. We do have private wine stores now, but still there's the level of choice is nothing like you get in the States.
You mentioned that you have another book in the works. Did Doing Drunk spark an idea for that, or is it going to influence that next book?
It's going to influence the next book after the next book.
Gotcha.
I'm doing the next book's probably going to be a monograph on oral psychology and virtue ethics that I've been thinking about writing for over a decade. But the next book after that is going to be a trade book about hedonism. So it's going to be, at the end of Drunk, I've laid out all these functional reasons why we should, make a place for intoxicants in our life, carefully and, in the right amount, but make a place for them. But then at the end, I point out that, we shouldn't neglect pleasure.
Yeah.
So, from an evolution doesn't care about pleasure. So if I'm going to make an evolutionary argument, I can't bring pleasure in, because evolution uses pleasure as a tool to get us to do things, but it doesn't care directly whether we're happy or not.
Mm.
But we care whether we're happy or not. We're
Right.
not our genes. And so I also at the end want to defend just pleasure for pleasure's sake, which I think is, again, something that we don't feel comfortable talking about in this kind of, neo-Puritan or neo-aesthetic view that you find in public discourse these days. So I want to defend pleasure. And I do it a bit at the end of the book, but that made me start to be worth writing a book just about pleasure more generally. So that'll be down the line, the next trade book.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to it because I think you're onto something. I felt your frustration at the end of the
Yeah,
book
yeah,
of going, okay, I've done it scientifically, but honestly, I just enjoy drinking. It's great.
yeah.
Why can't we just enjoy it? We shouldn't all be thinking about how bad it is. So
Or making functional arguments. Those are
yeah,
important scientifically, but at the end of the day, pleasure for pleasure's sake is important too.
yeah. And I think like when I go to a conference and I meet somebody for a drink at the bar, I'm not thinking about the practical benefits of that.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
well, maybe
yeah,
I'll get a new contract from them or we're going to
yeah,
have a
yeah,
new idea. I'm thinking I'm going to have a great drink and a great
yeah,
conversation. So, yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Edward. Thank you so much for your time. I
Yeah,
really
thanks.
appreciate it and a great book.